Beavers have been released back into the wild in Essex for the first time in 400 years. It's been done
in 2009. Britain did something it hadn't done in 400 years. It deliberately handed part of a river back to an animal it had spent centuries trying to erase. 11 beavers, quarantined and shipped in from Norway, stepped into a forgotten stretch of Scottish forest. And nobody watching that morning knew if the instinct to build, to dam, to flood had survived 4 centuries of complete absence, or if it had simply died out along with the species itself. What happened over the next 16 years didn't just answer that question. It rewrote how 3 nations think about their own rivers. What a beaver actually is. Before any of this story makes sense, the animal at the center of it needs an introduction, because most people picture something closer to a cartoon than what actually lived and nearly died out across an entire continent. The Eurasian beaver, known by the scientific name castor fiber, holds the title of Europe's largest rodent. A full-grown adult weighs around 19 kilograms and measures roughly a meter from nose to tail, built low and solid rather than sleek. An animal made for water rather than speed on land. It's also slightly bigger than the beaver most people actually picture when they hear the word. The North American species, familiar from decades of American nature, since Britain's own native beaver had vanished so thoroughly that its more famous cousin quietly filled the cultural gap left behind. Everything about its body serves the same purpose: a life spent mostly in freshwater. Rivers, lochs, streams, and wetlands aren't just where this animal happens to live. They're the only habitat it can actually survive in. Since a beaver's build, its dense fur and its broad, flattened tail only make sense in water and look almost comically out of place anywhere else. And despite centuries of folklore suggesting otherwise, this is not a predator. Beavers are herbivores, feeding entirely on grasses, bark, and woody vegetation, never fish. A detail worth remembering because it's about to matter a great deal once the myths about this animal start getting sorted from the facts. That's what the animal is. What it actually does to a landscape is a different question entirely. And it's the reason this story exists at all. Why the river needed them at all. That question has an answer, and it starts roughly 400 years ago, when this animal still had a country to live in, before people decided its body was worth more than its presence on the land. Eurasian beavers were hunted to extinction across Britain, driven out by demand for their pelts, their meat, and a scent gland secretion called castoreum, once prized in both perfume and medicine. The last confirmed sighting in Scotland comes from the Chronicles of Scotland in 1526. England held on slightly longer, with the last known beaver recorded in York in 1789. Either way, by the time anyone alive today was born, this animal had been gone from British rivers for longer than most nations have existed. What actually disappeared with it matters more than the extinction itself. Rivers that beavers had spent thousands of years shaping simply stopped being shaped. And water that used to slow down and spread out into wetlands began running straight through the landscape instead, out to sea with nothing left to hold it back. The infrastructure hadn't been dismantled by anyone. It had just lost the one species capable of maintaining it. And once that species was gone, nothing rebuilt what it left behind. That's the real scale of what 4 centuries of absence meant. Not a missing animal on a list somewhere, but a missing engineer and a landscape left to run without the one species that had always kept its water in check. Understanding what was lost is one thing. Understanding exactly how a single animal managed to keep a country's water in check in the first place is the part that explains everything that came after. What a beaver actually does. Explaining how one animal managed that job means starting with the word people usually reach for first. Keystone species. meaning a species whose presence or absence reshapes everything living around it, far beyond its own numbers.
Beavers manipulate the landscape on their own. It clears some of the woodland, it coppices trees, it brings in light.
A beaver earns that title through construction, not just consumption. It builds dams out of felled trees and packed mud, carves canals to move materials exactly where it wants them. And every time it strips bark from a living tree, it leaves behind standing deadwood that becomes shelter for insects and birds long after the tree itself has died. None of that is passive. It functions closer to a full-time engineering project than to ordinary animal behavior, and every piece of it feeds into the next. The dams are where most of that engineering pays off. By slowing the flow of water, they trap sediment and eroded soil before it can wash straight out to sea, filtering pollution out of the current as it moves through. So what flows downstream comes out cleaner than what flowed in.
It creates much-needed wetlands.
The wetlands that form behind those dams do more than just hold water in place. They lock carbon into the soil and the plants growing around them, keeping it out of the atmosphere rather than letting it release the way it would from dry, exposed land, which turns a beaver pond into a genuine tool against climate change, not just a picturesque side effect of the animal being there. One myth is worth clearing up directly here, since it's followed this species for centuries. Beavers do not eat fish. They're herbivores, living on bark, grasses, and woody plants, and far from harming fish populations. Research has actually found young salmon grow faster and healthier in streams shaped by beaver activity, not despite the dams, but partly because of them. And the scale this all happens on is smaller than most people expect. A beaver doesn't need a vast wilderness to do this work. As little as a couple of hectares of freshwater habitat, with enough trees and shrubs nearby, is enough for one family to transform. That's the theory, backed by decades of research across mainland Europe. What nobody could be sure of in 2009 was whether a species absent from Britain for 400 years still remembered how to do any of it, or whether 4 centuries away had simply broken the instinct for good. The release itself, a cautious experiment. That uncertainty is exactly why nothing about this release happened quickly, or without a plan for what to do if it failed. On May 28, 2009, 11 beavers stepped out into the lochs of Knapdale Forest in Argyll, sourced from Norway and split into 3 separate family groups. Before any of them reached Scottish water, they'd already spent months in quarantine, a mandatory isolation period used to catch and treat any disease in an animal before it's released, meant to stop anything harmful from spreading into a British ecosystem that had gone 4 centuries without this species. This wasn't a single organization acting alone either. The release was a joint effort between the Scottish Wildlife Trust, the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, and Forestry and Land Scotland, with veterinary lead Dr. Bob Bell overseeing the animals' welfare from quarantine through to the moment they entered the water. That level of care didn't stop once the beavers were finally free. A loch, for anyone picturing the terrain, is simply the Scottish word for a lake, and these particular lochs became the most closely watched stretch of water in the country almost overnight. Camera traps monitored them around the clock. Researchers collected DNA samples to track individual animals. Tracking data flowed in from the very first weeks, because nobody involved was willing to assume a 400-year absence would resolve itself cleanly on its own. That caution wasn't bureaucratic overkill. It reflected the actual stakes of what this was. This was Britain's first ever licensed mammal reintroduction, designed from the outset as a scientific trial meant to hand the Scottish government real evidence, not a symbolic gesture meant to generate headlines. Whether beavers stayed in Scotland permanently was never guaranteed on release day. It was a question the data itself would have to answer. The data didn't take long to start answering it. The instinct came back immediately. It didn't take a full season for the first answer to show up. It took weeks. By that first summer, freshly chewed stumps had already appeared along the water's edge, and the first small dams had begun taking shape. 400 years is a long time in human terms, long enough that nobody alive had ever seen a wild beaver in Britain. But to the animals themselves, it apparently meant nothing at all. What made the behavior remarkable wasn't just that it happened, but how precisely it happened. Dam placement wasn't scattered or random. Beavers responded directly to the shape of the land in front of them, adjusting their structures as the water's speed and the contour of the banks shifted around them. This wasn't trial and error playing out in slow motion. It read as something closer to inherited expertise, deployed correctly on the first attempt. And that's really the detail worth sitting with. Nobody taught these beavers how to do any of this. No older generation showed them where to place a dam or how to read a riverbank. The instinct simply resumed, fully intact, the moment the animals were given water to work with again. That instinct was the first sign the trial might actually work, but instinct alone was never going to decide whether these beavers got to stay. That decision belonged to the Scottish government, and it would take years of evidence to make it. The trial becomes a decision. That evidence didn't come from watching the beavers build. It came from years of independent scientists tracking exactly what that building did to everything around it, because a government wasn't going to change 4 centuries of policy based on a few good photographs. NatureScot, then still operating under its earlier name, Scottish Natural Heritage, ran that monitoring program for the full length of the trial, measuring the beaver's effect on the local environment against a strict scientific standard rather than public enthusiasm. Then, in 2015, that work finally came together into a single report, titled simply Beavers in Scotland, and it was formally presented to the Scottish government as the evidence the entire trial had been designed to produce. The report did its job. Instead of removing the beavers at the end of the study period, as the original trial terms had allowed for, the government let them stay permanently. A year later, in 2016, that decision widened into something bigger. Every wild beaver already living in Scotland, whether officially released or not, was declared free to remain. By 2019, the species had gone from a monitored experiment to something with real legal weight, formally protected as a native species under Scottish law. None of that happened on the strength of a good story. It happened because 6 years of hard data said the animals were doing exactly what the ecologists behind the trial had hoped they would. But permission to stay solved one problem while quietly creating another. Because the 11 beavers who started this were never going to be enough on their own. The genetic problem and the fix. The problem was buried in the beavers' own bloodlines, and no amount of legal protection was ever going to fix it. Because this was a biological weakness, not a policy one. Every animal in the founding population traced back to the same source population in Norway. In simple terms, the entire Scottish herd was descended from too small and too closely related a starting group, meaning the whole population was carrying essentially the same limited set of genes. A 2016 survey confirmed just how serious that had become and found something specific enough to worry the researchers directly. One breeding pair among the original founding families turned out to be father and daughter. That single detail mattered because it meant inbreeding wasn't a distant theoretical risk sitting somewhere down the line. It was already happening. At the very root of the population everyone was counting on to grow. Left alone, a narrow genetic base like that tends to catch up with a population eventually. So between 2017 and 2020, a reinforcement project brought in 21 additional beavers, deliberately sourced from Bavaria, specifically because that population carried different genetic stock entirely. Every one of those animals went through health screening and genetic testing before release, confirming each was a genuine Eurasian beaver rather than the North American species, and clearing them of disease before they ever reached a Scottish loch. The results, tracked by the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland's own genetics team, were exactly what the project needed. By 2020, the reinforced population had grown to an estimated 25 individuals, organized into 6 new family groups, and genetic sampling confirmed the diversity gap had genuinely closed. The population wasn't just larger anymore, it was measurably healthier. Getting the genetics right solved one uncertainty: what the beavers actually did to the land itself, once that uncertainty was gone, is where the real proof of this project shows up. The peer-reviewed proof. That proof didn't come from the project's own reports. It came from outside scientists with nothing riding on the outcome either way. In 2016, Dr. Nigel Wilby and colleagues at the University of Stirling published their findings in the journal Freshwater Biology, a peer-reviewed publication, meaning other independent scientists examine and challenge the research before it's ever allowed to print. Their study compared headwater streams with beaver activity against streams without it, across 13 hectares that researchers had already been monitoring since 2003, giving them over a decade of baseline data to measure any change against. What they found complicates the simple version of this story in an interesting way. Within any single beaver-influenced site, local plant diversity actually fell by around 27%. But across the wider landscape, diversity rose because beaver ponds weren't making every stretch of stream more similar to each other. They were creating a patchwork of genuinely different habitat types side by side, some wetter, some drier, some open, some choked with new growth. And that variety mattered more than any single site's numbers. But the rest of the findings were far more straightforward. Organic matter retention increased up to 7-fold. Aquatic plant life increased 20-fold. Phosphorus concentrations were cut in half, and nitrate levels dropped by more than 40%. Even with results this strong, the researchers didn't present them as an unqualified win. Their own paper stated plainly that these benefits have to be weighed against occasional negative impacts on fisheries, forestry, and farm crops. An honesty that matters, because it means what follows in this story isn't a fairy tale ending. It's a real, complicated trade-off that Scotland is still working through today. The Faery Isles. The clearest proof of any of this sits inside Knapdale itself, in a stretch of ground called the Faery Isles, and its transformation is documented well enough that the before and after aren't a matter of anyone's opinion. Aerial photographs from 2010 show exactly what the site looked like before any of this began. A straightened stream cutting through a block of planted conifer, with another section right next to it that had just been completely cleared of trees. In plain terms, it was ordinary commercial forestry land. Nothing about it different from thousands of similar plots scattered across Scotland. What changed its fate was a decision by Forestry and Land Scotland to do less rather than more. After the clearing finished, the organization chose not to replant the ground with more non-native timber, letting native trees grow back on their own instead. That choice mattered, because around 2014 and 2015, beavers dispersing south from the original release lochs found that regenerating ground and moved in. They didn't take long to get to work. Dams spread quickly across the old forestry drainage network, flooding ditches that had been cut decades earlier to keep the land dry, and pushing water sideways into channels and pools that hadn't existed before. Slowly, the site reconnected with its natural floodplain, re-wetting ground that had been engineered dry for generations, undoing decades of drainage work in a fraction of the time it took to dig it. That change didn't go unwatched. Pete Creech, from the heart of Argyll Wildlife Organization, has monitored this exact site for more than 15 years, and what he describes isn't vague enthusiasm. It's specific, almost technical admiration for how quickly a beaver works and how precisely it places a single dam to do the most with the least effort, something that still astounds him after 15 years of watching it happen. The wildlife that followed makes the case on its own. Redwings and fieldfares, migratory thrushes that spend winters in Britain, along with wrens, wagtails, otters, herons, teal, and kingfishers, have all reappeared in ground that offered none of them anything worth staying for before the beavers arrived. One wetland proved what was possible on a small scale. What happened next is that the rest of the country decided it wanted the same thing. The real friction. Wanting the same thing didn't mean everyone agreed on how to get it. And pretending this story has been conflict-free the whole way through would be dishonest. Some farmers and landowners have real, practical concerns about beaver dams flooding their fields. Concerns that aren't unreasonable, given how directly a dam can reshape water flow across land. People depend on for their livelihood. Fishing communities have raised a separate worry that dams might block fish migration, particularly for salmon trying to reach their spawning grounds upstream. Those two concerns needed two different answers, and the government gave both. Rather than protecting every dam equally, no matter where it sat, policy now allows a dam to be removed if it's causing real problems on farmland, while leaving the rest of the population alone. It's a compromise built to actually work, not a quiet way of undoing the reintroduction while pretending to support it. None of this amounts to evidence the project failed. It's evidence that bringing back an animal capable of reshaping an entire landscape was always going to require ongoing management, not a single release, followed by everyone simply walking away. Managing that friction in one country was one challenge. Scaling the whole approach up to 3 nations at once turned out to be a much bigger one. From one forest to 3 nations. That bigger challenge is exactly what's playing out now, well past anything the original Knapdale trial was built to test. Scotland's own numbers show how far this has come. The population there has grown to an estimated 1,500 animals, legally protected since 2019, no longer confined to a handful of test lochs. England followed that lead, licensing its first ever wild beaver release in March 2025 at Purbeck Heath, Dorset. More releases came after it at Holnacote Estate and along Cornwall's Pare and Fowey rivers. And Scotland didn't stop expanding either, releasing 7 more beavers at Glen Affric in October 2025, after years spent consulting the communities who'd actually be living alongside them. What's coming next is bigger than any of those individual releases suggest on their own. Roughly 100 more beavers are planned across 7 English rivers, waiting on licensing to finish, and dozens of additional projects are already being developed for rivers including the Humber, the Severn, and the Thames. Wales has started moving too, drafting its own legislation to protect the species and set up licensing for future releases there. 11 animals went into one forest in 2009, and nobody was confident they'd survive the winter. 16 years later, that uncertainty has become a policy framework reshaping how 3 nations manage their rivers.